Hello, everybody. What a morning we have had already here at SekuroKon. My name is Brianna Marlow. I am the vendor manager here at Sekuro, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the technical stream of SekuroKon 2023. So selfishly, I get to work with technology partners all day long, and I'm immersed in this world, and I'm really excited about the lineup that we have ahead of you today. We have brought together some absolutely brilliant minds from diverse roles, backgrounds, and industries to really give you that rounder view of the ever-evolving technical landscape beyond just the tools. So these sessions are short, sharp, and sweet, and like I said, with some of our brilliant speakers. Please catch them later on today to network. We don't have time for questions because we do have a very short, sharp agenda. But with that, I will welcome to the stage our first speaker, Mr. Zero Trust himself, our customer CISO and Head of Strategy and Architecture, Roebig.
Cool. G'day everyone. Roebig, customer CISO from Sekuro, and I also head up our strategy and architecture practice as well. Today I'm here to talk to you guys about something I'm really passionate about, and certainly my team are as well as the whole of Sekuro, and that's modernising security in both your strategy and your architecture as well. And a really key thing that helps do that, we find, is a set of principles aligned with Zero Trust. Now the proof is in the pudding, and I'm going to provide you some pudding today, with a few use cases about real business benefits and real security issues that have been overcome in organisations while aligning with the modern architecture through Zero Trust. So in terms of the agenda today, we'll start off and we'll talk about what do I mean by modernising security? What does that even mean? Why would you even look at it as well? Why is it so important? How Zero Trust relates to all of this? I'm going to talk about those juicy use cases I talked about before, and then end with some closing thoughts. So pretty straightforward on this lightning talk today. And thanks all for your time here. So I'm going to start off with an opening statement that I think is really important, and I'm sure most of us in this room can resonate well with. Our security strategy must embrace, whilst also adapting to and securing modern technology initiatives and the modern technology and threat landscape that has changed as a result of that. What do I mean by modernising security? Well, I mean that modernising security means accepting things have changed and preparing your security program to address them and even embrace them at the same time, instead of being the current that works against it. When I say changing things and what's changed, I mean things like people, devices, data, access from anywhere, logged into from anywhere, at any time. An attacker also could be inside our systems at any time, due to the sheer amount of exposure we've had to add to enable our people and our business and our data to be available anywhere. On top of that, technology initiatives. Things like SaaS applications. They don't need IT's help anymore to be spun up within a business. Nowadays, if finance or HR need to solve a problem, they don't need to come to talk to IT about an SQL database and an application server that they have no idea what it means anymore. They can type that problem into Google and find the solution to that in minutes. And before you know it, the entire department has changed the way that they work. Great for them, but is storing organisational data in there, something we don't even know about. Not good for us or the organisation as a whole. Our applications that we do know about are also not even in our data centre anymore. They've either been SaaSified, as I like to call it, or they've moved to some form of cloud infrastructure. Really, in summary, is that our attack surface is far bigger than it ever has been before, and security has to support this digital transformation. Why? Why do we need to modernise our security program? We know what it is now and what it's all about. Why is it so important? Well, our traditional approach to security really treated our organisation like a castle. There was walls that we'd build around all the valuable stuff inside. We knew what was inside and we knew how to protect it. That is a big problem now, when plenty of our valuable assets have gone walkabout away from our castle. And our people on a daily basis probably even live outside that castle. So everything we've invested in the past is powerless in many scenarios in a modern enterprise now. If security says no or tries to slow the business down in wanting to digitally transform, we risk becoming known as the disabler, the naysayer of what the business wants to do, which means we lose the most powerful thing we could ever have as a security leader or department within an organisation, And that isn't tools or technology or controls, it's influence. If you lose influence, you've lost the game. And if we think about our old approach anyway, which I'm sure many of us are either grappling with now or we've grappled with in the past, was it even that great? Firewalls upon firewalls, network architecture that was really complicated, VLANs coming up the wazoo, tech debt, proxies, all sorts of things stacked on top of each other to achieve these security outcomes in our walled castle. Things that we had to patch ourselves, things that wouldn't interoperate together very well, so we were tackling alerts all the time. In summary, really there was just a lot of complexity. Now, how does this relate to zero trust? Well, as you all know, I like to talk about zero trust. So, zero trust is really about gathering more context before we allow things to happen in our environment. As an example, let's say somebody wants to upload some data to somewhere. Instead of just going, we'll block that website, we now need to understand what is in that data. What device did this person do it from? Is that device secure? Who was this person? What time of day did this happen? Was there any abnormality? And if all those things check out, in other words, they're doing the right thing that they normally do, they don't even notice anything's happening. But if any of those things don't check out, we know that there's an attacker, or it could be potentially a malicious insider threat. And so we stop it. So in summary, really, not just in that example, but in many examples, we gather up more context before we decide that something should or should not be trusted, and how much to trust it. Now, with this context, the most valuable thing we get from that, and how it really helps modernize our security program, is when we understand more about what's happening, like in that example I gave, we can start to say no in very specific, small case scenario places. When we know that the risk is actually high, we'll deny something happening. But we'll say yes to the business far more often, which again makes us a better influencer throughout the business. It really allows us to embrace modern use cases while securing any emerging technology and also what our business is currently trying to do. Really, the principles of zero trust to remember and think about integrating in your organizations is assuming a breach can happen at any time. That includes any asset, any user, anything, any server could be breached at any time. Reduce your attack surface wherever possible without being a business disabler. Essentially allow your business to digitally transform securely and take security beyond the perimeter so it follows anyone and any piece of data at any time. Now, let's get into the main meat of this. Who would have thought that you can reduce costs and reduce complexity while enhancing security at the same time? It's almost like an oxymoron, that sentence, right? It contradicts itself. How could we increase security whilst making things less complex and even costing less as well? I think use cases and real customer stories are the best ones to share to kind of articulate this point. So I'll talk about not just one customer, many customers that we've worked with in this space and helping them align with a zero trust architecture and strategy, what they've been able to do. So this particular scenario was a common scenario that we're all probably going through or have gone through in our organizations. They had firewalls at the perimeter, a fairly flat network once you're inside. They had a VPN appliance to ensure that people had some way to do this stuff remotely. They had a proxy to monitor all the web traffic that sat on premise as well. And that did the web filtering, of course, and all that sort of thing. Now, to interconnect all their environments, they paid top dollar for MPLS links, a typical corporate enterprise sort of environment. Now, what we found with that, with the downsides of that, in terms of a modern security threats that affect organizations is, well, when people walk outside the castle, the proxy doesn't follow them. It's a physical piece of infrastructure that we have to host ourselves. The firewall sits at our edge. It doesn't protect people beyond the edge. Applications that have moved beyond the edge weren't adequately protected by the network-related infrastructure we'd put in place. On top of this, this was all self-hosted with 4 or 5 technologies all stacked on top of each other in the more, matching that more legacy example I gave before. And it was a poor user experience, let's not forget as well. When people work from home, they had to use a VPN that worked differently to the way it works when they're in the office. Now, what we helped this organization do, and it was through modernizing their security strategy and architecture, through aligning with a ZT strategy, is they transitioned from Basically, a traditional kind of firewall and VPN appliance and a proxy that worked all on-premise, all of these 5 technologies went into one platform. That platform allowed seamless VPN-like access, but heavily segmented on a per-user basis, so a more superior solution than a VPN. On top of that, it did seamless web category browsing protection, browser isolation, as we mentioned earlier on stage before, and also covered all of their DLP requirements, no matter where anyone was, anywhere in the world, through one particular cloud-based service. Now, what this allowed them to do as well, because they had this very consistent way to ensure that people could connect remotely and connect on-prem the same way and require SSO and MFA and heavily segmented access, it meant that they no longer needed a VPN appliance, they no longer needed a proxy, their edge firewalls, a lot of that particular requirements weren't required anymore. And it meant that they were able to decommission those 4 other services or 5 other services, go into one, and create a better user experience with reduced cost and reduced complexity at the same time. And on top of that, the real cherry on top is that their MPLS links, so they were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for every year, they didn't need those anymore either. Huge cost savings to the business, and security got a massive uplift with a better user experience at the same time. Network segmentation is the next example I'm going to give, and I've playfully called this network segmentation on easy mode. Once again, a bit of an oxymoron sentence. Who would have thought network segmentation and the word easy should ever go together? I'm too sure we can all appreciate that. We've got plenty of horror stories to share about that. So this scenario in this organization, and many we've worked with, is pretty permissive networks on-premise. Network segmentation, they knew about this. They knew it was a big risk. But network segmentation was always in the too hard basket for this organization. There are reasons were many that we share inside our organizations or have shared. What do we do with hot desking when we're trying to tag certain ports for access to certain things? That doesn't work when we're trying to do a traditional approach to segmentation. How do we understand what all of our applications are doing? What about our VPNs? Because when someone goes through a VPN, whatever we put in, these great on-prem related segmentation things don't actually work. All these question marks were in their head about how they were ever going to be able to achieve this. And the answer was pretty obvious to them. It was in the too hard basket, and they didn't think it was possible. Of course, the downside of a heavily open network is once there's a present attacker, it's game over a lot of the time. They can discover a lot of different infrastructure. The team felt like they were running on a hamster wheel. Constantly, every time there was a patch that came out that affected their infrastructure, they were patching everything, everywhere, all the time, which was untenable for most organizations, or at least taking up a lot of valuable time that they could be spending on more proactive things rather than reactive. So the downsides were many. Now what we allowed them to do and showed them we could do is similar to the example I gave before in my simplification scenario. They moved to a zero trust network access broker solution. Most people think of, when they hear about, I'm sure a lot of you in this room have heard about zero trust network access brokers. Most people think of them as VPN alternatives, but when you think about this from the zero trust lens and a bit more end-to-end, you realize that this can actually control the way your internal network works as well and allow you essentially that shortcut to network segmentation. So the way this worked was, there's an agent on every single user's endpoint. That agent would require single sign-on authentication at the beginning of every day, all the great stuff, MFA, good authentication policies that was through their SSO provider. And then behind the scenes in the zero trust network access broker, there were specific policies tailored down to the relevant user groups that things are in. And that would dynamically change the policy depending on who authenticated. Shared machines, hot desking, remote work, it all worked the same way. Inside their network, they were then able to completely sever the permanent trust that they had between their corporate environment, their corporate user environment, and their data center. Essentially, shortcutting their way to network segmentation, and even indirectly putting things like MFA and SSO and gating access even into their valuable infrastructure. That meant that HR, IT, finance could all sit right next to one another on the same IP range without any complicated VLANs and MAC address and port tagging and all that kind of thing, and have completely different levels of access, heavily segmented from each other. The other thing that meant is once there was an attacker in the environment, port scanning, vulnerability scanning, everything became invisible to the attacker because they weren't on a corporate device, they weren't properly authenticated, so there was no trust there. Back down to zero trust. Last one is MFA. something I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with. We made the MFA better, faster, and everywhere. Now, the scenario in this organization was heavily disjointed MFA. There was Microsoft Authenticator for logging onto Microsoft. There was Google Authenticator for the OTP code type stuff. And then there was, of course, SMS-based MFA, which most of us probably aren't fans of. Now, the downside of this, of course, so one thing I forgot to mention is there were plenty of legacy apps and infrastructure in their business that didn't support MFA. So you know what they did? They raised the risk with their business and said, these legacy applications need to be gotten rid of because they do not support modern authentication mechanisms. It'll cost, I think the quote they gave me was like $10 to $20 million to replace this because it just went throughout the entire business and had been around for over a decade. And that was what it was. They thought they'd done the right thing, they'd raised the risk, it was in the too hard basket, the business had understood it. We had a chat to them and said, what if you could make MFA and SSO and these modern mechanisms in front of all of your legacy applications without having to reconfigure the legacy app whatsoever? This pricked up their ears. This is the very thing we allow them to do. So the first thing we did was we centralized all the identities. We want that. We want a consistent MFA and SSO experience across the board. We started with their SaaS apps. That's easy, right? But to extend it down to their legacy applications, to explain it in technical details, but not getting too in the weeds, an agent sat on their domain controller. It then looked for specific policies based on the authentication request going through to specific IPs and subnets. When something matched, it would grab and hold that authentication packet before sending to a legacy application and require the user to have a push notification on their endpoint. The legacy app didn't care. Once it received the authentication packet, everything worked perfectly. And we were able to add MFA in front of all of those internal applications that previously were going to cost tens of millions of dollars to replace, which, let's face it, would never get done. Suddenly that business, not just that legacy app, but everything was protected. MFA became better, faster, and it became everywhere. So the key patterns that I really want you to sort of observe, and you probably have already, is that security posture grew in all these scenarios, but simultaneously user experience improved and costs and complexity reduced at the same time. We've had our cake and we've eaten it too. And I think that's one of the best ways to sum up what a modern security architecture like Zero Trust can really do inside of a lot of businesses. So the key takeaways I want to leave you with today is adapt your strategy and your architecture to a modern business. Raising the risk, like that scenario I gave about, hey, we need to replace our legacy apps because they don't support this, is not enough. We need to take that step back and be a bit of an inventor in this way and go, is there another way? Let's have a really good look. Let's be really creative about what could possibly be out there to solve this problem. Make sure we've looked into it properly because there's always new technologies and tricks that are coming out that solve these actual modern problems we have. Next one is modernize your security principles aligning with Zero Trust. You don't have to call yourself doing a full Zero Trust strategy. I suggest you do, but you don't have to. You can understand the principles of Zero Trust and integrate them into your strategy and your principles that your teams already use already. Things like assuming a breach at any time, things like reducing your attack surface. These are valuable things that every organization needs to be doing now for a modern security architecture. Any of the too hard baskets that you've had in the past, like some of the ones I mentioned today perhaps, but there's many others, of course, revisit them with a modern lens. As I said before, there's so many more things available to us now, especially in the last 5 years. The pandemic accelerated all of these modern security risks from happening. And of course, technology companies have continued to innovate alongside that. So take another look at those too hard baskets. You may find it's a lot more possible than you previously thought. Last but not least is about making sure that we do improve user experience and we do reduce cost and complexity over time. And the big essential thing to that is not just doing this great stuff that I talked about here, but it's making sure that when you do introduce something new, something that solves a lot of these problems, ensure that any redundant controls or weak controls that are providing meaningless value are removed. You don't want to keep something around that continues to create a poor user experience and cost when you've replaced it with something up here that's far more powerful. Of course, I'm a fan of defense in depth, but there is a limit to that, and you need to always be looking at these things with a fine-tooth comb as well. Thank you very much. It does say questions up there, but as Bree said, I'm not allowed them, so come and chat with me later. Thanks, everyone.